Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Dr. Bernie Vigod Memorial Lecture in Human Rights, presented by the Atlantic Human Rights Center and St. Thomas University. I'm Dr. Shannon Brooke Murphy, Acting Director of the Atlantic Human Rights Center. Throughout today's event, your microphones and cameras will be off, but we still want to hear from you. So our featured speaker will answer questions following his lecture. And we encourage you to submit any questions you may have by using the Q&A box located in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You can also pre-submit your questions at any time, either before the lecture gets started or during the lecture itself. At this moment, I'd like to remind all of our panelists to keep your microphones muted and your cameras switched off when you're not speaking, and to remember to both unmute and turn your camera back on as you are ready to begin your portion of the program. We'll just give it a moment or two before we get started properly. Okay. At this time, I am pleased and honored to give the floor to St. Thomas University President, Dr. Dawn Russell, to pass along her greetings to this meeting and her welcoming remarks. A very warm welcome, President Russell.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. I'd like to join Dr. Murphy in welcoming everyone to St. Thomas University and to the 31st Vigod Memorial Lecture in Human Rights. I'd like to acknowledge that the land in which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq peoples. On our campus, we fly the flags of the Wolastoqiyik and the Mi'kmaq Grand Council to publicly acknowledge that STU is located on the traditional territory of the Wolastoqiyik. We look forward to the Vigod Lecture every year. Over 3 decades, we have attracted national and international human rights leaders to our campus. Our human rights program, which is the only one of its kind in Atlantic Canada, approaches human rights through the lens of law and activism, and the Vigod Lecture nicely complements what our students learn from their professors. This lecture was established to honor and to commemorate the work of historian Dr. Bernie Vigod, who was an advocate of human rights and civil liberties. In 1971, he joined the Department of History at the University of New Brunswick, where he taught for 17 years. An outstanding teacher and scholar, Dr. Vigod was also an Associate Dean of UNB's School of Graduate Studies and Research, as well as a member of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Dr. Vigod served the cause of human rights with distinction. He spoke and published extensively on human rights issues. He advised public officials on matters related to human rights, and he was a leader in many organizations dedicated to the promotion of human rights. This lecture series is dedicated to his memory. And this evening, we're pleased to welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. David Boyd, whose subject, a healthy and sustainable environment as a human right, is certainly topical. We all face challenges from climate change, pollution, and the loss of natural habitats on a global scale. And indeed, last week, the United Nations Human Rights Council formally recognized the human right to a healthy environment for the very first time. And I know that Dr. Boyd considers this development a breakthrough, and I have no doubt that he'll say something on that matter. Dr. Bernie Vigod was an inspiring scholar and teacher. He was an ardent promoter of human rights and a tireless advocate for justice. Through our teaching of human rights, we try to live up to that ideal. I want to thank you all for joining us, and to thank you, Dr. Boyd, for giving generously of your time to speak to our community this evening.
Thank you so much, President Russell, for your generous welcome to open this event. We really greatly appreciate it. Now, On behalf of the Atlantic Human Rights Center, I just want to say a few brief words about tonight's program. First, of course, we are deeply honored by and most grateful to our featured speaker, Dr. David Boyd, for taking time out of his extremely busy schedule to give tonight's lecture. And here he is, fresh from his recent human rights triumph in Geneva. We are likewise grateful to Dr. Janice Harvey for agreeing to moderate this event, and to the entire Vigod family for making tonight's event possible in memory of the late Dr. Bernie Vigod. Many thanks are also due for the generous and essential behind-the-scenes support of Dr. Christina Shirley and Brianna Bourgeois of the Atlantic Human Rights Center, of Jeffrey Carlton, Vice President of Communications, and Jacqueline Cormier in the STU Communications Office, and especially to Michael McCracken from the STU recruitment team, who is providing all of the technical support for this virtual lecture, and we really couldn't have done it without him. All have made very important contributions to this evening's success. I would be remiss, of course, if I did not say we're also very pleased that in this time of pandemic-induced online meeting fatigue, that each and every one of you in our audience has taken the time and the effort to join us for this special event. Your presence is important and it's greatly appreciated. So in a few moments, I will introduce this evening's moderator, and she in turn will introduce our guest speaker. As I said earlier, following Dr. Boyd's presentation, there will be time for questions, which you may submit at any time using the Q&A tool, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Your submitted questions will be received and directed to Dr. Boyd by our moderator, Dr. Harvey. Finally, Dr. Vigod's widow, Zena Simpsis, will finish up this evening's event with several award presentations and closing remarks on behalf of the family. Our moderator tonight is Dr. Janice Harvey, familiar to some of you, and I can think of no one better suited for the task, not only because of her familiarity with our guest speaker's body of work, not only because of the decades of leadership she has provided within the environmentalist movement here in New Brunswick, but also because she too has supported the linkage between the environment and human rights. Dr. Harvey brings more than 25 years experience in environmental advocacy to her current role as coordinator of the St. Thomas University Environment and Society program and coordinator of the Faculty Environmental Research Network. Among other contributions, she is past executive director of the Conservation Council of New Brunswick. She is former chair of the Canadian Environmental Network and former member of the board of directors of the Canadian Environmental Defence Fund. She served 10 years on the Premier's Roundtable on Environment and Economy. She is an award-winning veteran of a great many environmental protection campaigns, having received recognition for her efforts as recipient of the Gulf of Maine Visionary Award from the Gulf of Maine Council on the Marine Environment, and the Orca Award from the New Brunswick Environmental Network, and the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. May I now present and hand over proceedings to our moderator, Dr. Janice Harvey. Thank you, Janice.
Thank you very much, Shannon Brook. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our guest lecturer this evening. David Boyd is a professor of law, policy, and sustainability at the University of British Columbia, jointly appointed to the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. Dr. Boyd holds a PhD in Resource Management and Environmental Studies from UBC, a law degree from the University of Toronto, and a business degree from the University of Alberta. His career has included serving as the Executive Director of Eco-Justice, arguing cases before the Supreme Court of Canada, and working as Special Advisor on Sustainability for former Prime Minister Paul Martin. He has advised many governments on environmental, constitutional, and human rights policy, and he is a member of the World Commission on Environmental Law an expert advisor for the UN's Harmony with Nature initiative, a member of the Environmental Law Alliance worldwide, and of the IUCN's Commission on Environmental Law. Dr. Boyd's current research interest is the subject of tonight's lecture, the potential for a rights-based approach to laws and policies that will accelerate the transition to an ecologically sustainable and just future. 3 of his 10 books are on this subject: The Environmental Rights Revolution, a global study of constitutions, human rights, and the environment in 2011, The Right to a Healthy Environment, Revitalizing Canada's Constitution in 2012, and most recently, The Rights of Nature in 2017. He also appeared in the late Silver Donald Cameron's award-winning 2016 documentary, Green Rights, The Human Right to a Healthy World. David Boyd's work on environmental rights is recognized internationally, leading to his appointment as the UN Special Rapporteur, in the language of the UN Human Rights Council, on the issue of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Special rapporteurs within the Human Rights Council play the role of independent fact finders and monitors to address either country-specific situations or thematic issues. These experts work on a voluntary basis. They are not UN staff and do not receive a salary for their work. They are independent from any government or organization and serve in their individual capacity. Dr. Boyd was appointed as a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment for a 3-year term commencing August 1st, 2018, and has recently been appointed to a second term from 2021 to 2024. In this position, he has prepared 4 reports for the Human Rights Council: The Right to a Healthy Environment in 2018 with John Knox, outgoing Special Rapporteur; A Safe Climate, Human Rights and Climate Change in 2019, The Right to Breathe Clean Air 2019, and Good Practices Implementing the Right to a Healthy Environment in 2020. And these reports are all available on the website of the UN Human Rights Council. As President Russell has noted, just last week, Dr. Boyd witnessed a major breakthrough at the UN level when the Human Rights Council passed a resolution declaring a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment to be a human right. The resolution, proposed by Costa Rica, the Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland, was passed with 43 votes in favor and 4 abstentions from Russia, India, China, and Japan. The human right to a healthy environment has been endorsed by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet, and 15 UN agencies. And this resolution will now go to the UN General Assembly for further consideration. The Human Rights Council decision comes just weeks before the crucial UN Climate Change Summit, COP26, starting on October 31st in Glasgow. And this assures that the issue of impacts of climate change on human rights will be on the table in these critical negotiating sessions. And I'm sure Dr. Boyd will have much more to say about this development in his lecture, the subject of which is how global recognition of the human right to a healthy and sustainable environment could be a catalyst for the rapid, systemic, and transformative societal changes that are necessary if we are to avoid social and economic breakdown due to climate change. Before I turn the floor over to our guest, I invite you once again to use the Q&A feature to submit any questions you may have for Dr. Boyd. And during the question period following the lecture, we will get to as many of them as possible. So now, with no further ado, I pass the virtual talking stick over to our guest, David Boyd.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Harvey. And I really feel like after that generous introduction, you could have been the person giving the Vigod Memorial Lecture this year. However, I am absolutely delighted to be playing this role, to be joining you today from the west coast of Canada, from Sideas, Pender Island, which is in the traditional territory of the Coast Salish First Nations. and also the endangered southern resident killer whales. As President Russell and Professor Harvey have said, it's been quite a week in terms of human rights and the environment, and I'll be saying a bit more about that later on. But I want to start out really by talking about the big picture. The fact that scientists estimate there are 100 billion planets in the Milky Way galaxy, and even more beyond that in the rest of the universe. Avengers movies actually suggest that, there may actually be a multiverse. But despite the best efforts of generations of scientific geniuses, there's only one planet that we know supports life, Earth. This beautiful blue-green planet is a miracle, chock-a-block full of natural wonders. And despite the deluded fantasies of billionaires obsessed with living on Mars, the Earth is the only home that humanity will ever know. And yet we take this beautiful planet for granted, and human beings have inflicted cataclysmic harm upon it. When I was born, not that long ago, the human population was 3.2 billion. Today, it's almost 8 billion. During my lifetime, the global economy and greenhouse gas emissions have tripled. We've created a climate emergency, a biodiversity crisis, and pervasive pollution that causes 9 million premature deaths every year, as well as a surge in emerging infectious diseases of zoonotic origin, exemplified by this terrible COVID-19 pandemic. Now, because the human brain can really not comprehend these statistics, I want to just pause for a minute and share a story and an image. This is Ellie Kissy-DeBra, a beautiful, radiant child from the UK who loved music and swimming and dreamed of becoming a pilot. But her life was cut short in 2013 at the age of 9. Ella lived in a poor and heavily polluted part of London, England, and she suffered from severe asthma. Whenever air quality deteriorated in her neighborhood, she would have an asthma attack, and she ended up going to the emergency room at the local hospital 27 times over the course of 3 years. On February 15th, 2013, Ella didn't recover. And last year, a coroner's inquest into her death found, for the first time in the world, that air pollution was a direct cause of a specific individual's death. So I implore you, the next time you hear an abstract statistic about environmental degradation, to think of Ella. The reality is that virtually all human rights depend on a healthy biosphere and a safe climate. Without functioning ecosystems, which depend on healthy biodiversity, there would be no clean air to breathe, no safe water to drink, no nutritious food to eat. Healthy ecosystems provide renewable supplies of wood, fiber, food, fish, and other goods. And healthy ecosystems also regulate the Earth's climate, filter the air, filter water, recycle nutrients, and mitigate the impact of natural disasters. It boggles my mind to think that a simple teaspoon of healthy soil contains literally billions of microorganisms, algae, bacteria, fungi, and more, that feed plants and protect them from pests and pathogens. And yet, among the human rights that are threatened by the global environmental crisis are the rights to life, health, food, water, cultural rights, the rights of the child, and of course, the right to a healthy environment. For one example, coastal communities we know that are no longer protected by healthy mangrove ecosystems are more likely to suffer deaths when struck by cyclones, threatening the right to life. The decline of agricultural biodiversity increases the risks of crop failure, while the loss of pollinators jeopardizes 3/4 of crops, posing a threat to the right to food. For decades, governments have signed treaties and made pledges to tackle climate change and halt the decline of biodiversity, most notably in 1992 with the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. In retrospect, however, these represent an embarrassing litany of bold rhetoric, timid action, and broken promises. Since 1982, as you can see from this chart, natural gas use is up over 80%, coal use is up 68%, and oil use is up over 30%. Overall, greenhouse gas emissions have risen more than 65% since nations agreed to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the Earth's climate system in 1992. Similarly, none of the nature-saving targets agreed upon by parties to the Biodiversity Convention in 2000 were met by 2010. None of the Aichi biodiversity targets agreed to in 2010 were achieved by 2020. And the reason is that these international environmental laws have an Achilles heel. They have a lack of compliance and enforcement mechanisms. And that means that states like Canada are able to make these bold commitments, but then when they fail to fulfill those commitments, they're never held accountable. And so we're at a time when scientists' warnings have never been more dire or more clear. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and the World Health Organization are all calling for rapid, systemic, and transformative changes to human society to address the global environmental crisis. And that's why we talk about human rights, because human rights have a really vital and promising role to play in this. And if we look back at recent centuries of human evolution, we can see many examples of where human rights have been catalysts for societal transformations, including the abolition of slavery, progress towards equality for women, the end of apartheid, and even today, rights continue to be strategically and successfully used by Indigenous peoples, by people of color, by LGBTQ plus persons, persons with disabilities, and more. Now, it's never easy or simple, nor are human rights omnipotent, but there can be no doubt that human rights have sparked societal transformations. And in the context of the global environmental crisis, human rights can and are helping to overcome the weaknesses of international environmental law. In 2019, for example, the Supreme Court of the Netherlands in the Urgenda case ruled that the Dutch government had violated its citizens' right to life under the European Convention on Human Rights by failing to sufficiently reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The court acknowledged the science of climate change and ordered the government to make faster, deeper emissions cuts. The Dutch government responded by closing a coal-fired power plant, investing billions of dollars in renewable energy, putting solar panels on the roofs of schools, reducing speed limits on highways, and more. And so that decision really illustrates that when you combine environmental law and human rights law, you get accountability. And climate cases based on human rights are springing up all over the world. The Torres Strait Islanders, a group of Indigenous people living off the coast of Australia, have filed a case against Australia with the UN Human Rights Committee, arguing that Australia's abysmal record on climate change violates their rights to life, health, and culture. Greta Thunberg and 15 other young people filed a similar case with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, asserting that inadequate climate action violates their rights. And just 2 days ago, the committee released its decision, finding that children in country A do have the right to sue governments in country B, where country B is producing greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to the global climate crisis. Unfortunately, the case was dismissed on technical legal grounds, but it did establish this important principle of extraterritorial obligations. Even more powerful, though, in the context of the planetary environmental emergency is the emergence of this new human right, the right to a healthy environment. And this right first began appearing in state constitutions in the US back in 1970. At the international level, it was first mentioned in the Stockholm Declaration in 1972. Portugal and Spain were the first countries to put this right in their constitutions back in 1976 and 1978. And today, this right enjoys constitutional protection in more than 100 countries around the world. It's found in the environmental laws of 100 countries as well. And it first began appearing in regional human rights treaties in 1981 in the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. And then it has spread to other regions of the world, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and just a few weeks ago, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe published a proposal to add a new protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights that would recognize the right to a healthy environment for the 47 member states of the Council of Europe. People often ask me, well, what is the right to a healthy environment? And my answer is that it's actually a bundle of procedural and substantive rights. On the substantive side, it includes clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, non-toxic environments where people can live, work, study, and play, healthy ecosystems, both on land and in water, and a safe climate. And then the procedural rights are things like access to information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice. And then the interpretation of this right has to be guided by key principles, including non-discrimination, non-regression, precaution, and prevention. And people also ask me, would it really make a difference? And the answer is unequivocally yes. Research demonstrates that in those countries where the right to a healthy environment is recognized, it has served as a catalyst for stronger environmental laws and policies, improved implementation and enforcement of those laws and policies, higher levels of public participation in environmental decision-making, and most importantly, improved environmental performance. So countries that recognize this right in their constitutions have reduced air pollution more quickly, reduced greenhouse gas emissions more quickly, and provided safe drinking water to a higher share of their citizens. And I thought it would be interesting to just go on a quick tour of the planet and look at a few examples of this. So for example, in Slovenia is one of the countries that, as Janice mentioned, was a proponent of the recognition of the right to a healthy environment at the UN. And a few years ago, Slovenia was basically in last place in Europe in terms of the amount of waste that was being put in landfills and garbage dumps, at about 76% as of 2009. They decided to get serious about recycling and composting, and they've reduced the percentage of waste going to landfill from 76% to less than 7%. And Slovenia also has increased the percentage of their country that's protected in national parks to almost 40%. Another leader is Costa Rica, a small middle-income nation with a really inspiring story of the power of the right to a healthy environment. Since they added the right to a healthy environment to their constitution in 1994, Costa Rica has reversed a decades-long process of deforestation and doubled forest cover from less than 25% to more than 50%. They've increased the proportion of land in national parks to almost 30%. They've passed laws that prohibit open pit mining and oil and gas development. They generate 98% of their electricity from renewable sources, including wind, solar, hydroelectric, and geothermal. And they use carbon tax revenues to pay indigenous people and farmers to restore their land and to regenerate forests. Costa Rica also has a detailed plan to become one of the first countries in the world to completely decarbonize their economy. And Costa Rica was the leading nation in the effort to have the United Nations recognize the right to a healthy environment. So we all owe a debt of gratitude to Costa Rica. France is another country that is an environmental leader and added the right to a healthy environment to the French Constitution more recently, just in 2004. Since then, France has become the first country in the world to ban fracking for oil and gas, the first country in the world to ban all uses of the bee-killing neonicotinoid pesticides, and the first country in the world to prohibit the export of pesticides to other countries that are not allowed to be used in France. France also has passed a law recognizing that people have the right to breathe clean air and is being held accountable for that obligation in a series of inspiring court cases. Croatia is another country that has recognized the right to a healthy environment, and that has compelled Croatia, in the words of the Croatian government, to protect, conserve, and restore biodiversity and ecosystems by putting nature protection at the top of the political agenda. They say that conservation of nature is one of the highest values of the constitutional order, and Croatia has protected 38% of its territory. In Argentina, thanks to the right to a healthy environment, citizens filed a lawsuit against multiple levels of government and won a resounding judgment in 2008 that has resulted in billions of dollars being spent to restore the Matanza Riachuelo watershed, which was previously one of the most polluted places in South America. And finally, they're respecting the human rights of people who live in this area, including this family that previously lived in a corrugated metal shack on the banks of the Riachuelo River. And because of this decision based on the right to a healthy environment, you can see they've just received a key to a newly constructed unit of social housing where this boy will enjoy running water and electricity and a flush toilet for the first time in his young life. In Chile, the right to a healthy environment recently prompted the beginnings of cleanup of a notorious sacrifice zone called Quintero Puchuncavi. In Kenya, the right to a healthy environment was used to block a very ill-advised coal-fired power plant on the East Coast. In Mexico, the right to a healthy environment was used to stop a tourism project that was destroying a mangrove ecosystem, and the court ordered the company to begin restoring that ecosystem. In the Philippines, the right to a healthy environment was used by the Supreme Court to order a cleanup of Manila Bay and the surrounding area, and that cleanup and restoration project is underway. It's not complete, but remarkable progress is being made. And one of my favorite stories comes from Colombia, where this group of 25 children and youth sued their own government, saying that deforestation in the Amazon portion, the Colombian portion of the Amazon rainforest, violated their right to a healthy environment. And again, the Supreme Court of Colombia agreed with these young people and ordered the government to come up with a plan to end deforestation in the Amazon. Last fall, I appeared virtually before the Supreme Court of Brazil in a case challenging the government's climate and forest policies as being inconsistent with the right to a healthy environment. Still waiting for a decision in that case. We just had a terrific decision from a court in Indonesia in a case about the horrific air pollution in the capital of Jakarta. And I was delighted to see the court make numerous references to my report on clean air and human rights in ordering the government to take much more ambitious action to improve air quality. I'm also involved in a lawsuit in the Mpumalanga region of South Africa, one of the most polluted places on earth, where the allegation is that the government's failure to improve air quality violates the right to a healthy environment. So you can see these cases come from all over the world and really reflect the power of the right to a healthy environment. Now, I should be clear, it's not a magic wand. So we actually lost a case last year about new oil and gas development off the coast of Norway when the Supreme Court of Norway upheld the government's decision to issue permits for offshore oil and gas development in the Arctic Ocean off the coast of Norway. So it's not a perfect solution. And as has been mentioned several times, until last week, the right to a healthy environment had never been recognized at the global level, despite efforts by civil society dating back to the 1990s. That all changed last Friday in this room at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. A group of states, as mentioned earlier, led by Costa Rica, the Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland, moved forward over the past year with this resolution to recognize the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. They were supported by more than 1,300 civil society organizations around the world, the UN Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the head of the UN Environment Program. I had a wonderful moment in September where a group of children delivered a petition to me that they had gathered almost 150,000 signatures on, calling for the UN to recognize their right to a healthy environment. We even got more than 50 leading businesses to write a letter of support for this action. And I have to tell you that last week was a real roller coaster in Geneva. There was fierce opposition from a number of powerful nations, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. And I can tell you that on Wednesday morning, things looked quite bleak for this resolution, but through the combined efforts of civil society, Costa Rica, Slovenia, and a really intense last-minute effort, we were able to turn things around. And as Janice mentioned, 43 countries voted in favor, none voted against, and 4 countries, Japan, Russia, China, and India, abstained from the vote. And, you know, people will say, do UN resolutions really make a difference? And I think my answer is yes, they do. And I'll give you an example. In 2010, the United Nations recognized for the first time the human right to water. And since then, that right has been added to constitutions in countries all over the world. And constitutions are the highest and strongest law in all countries. So in Costa Rica, in Fiji, in Mexico, in Slovenia, in Tunisia, and others, people now have a constitutional right to a constitutional right to water. And other countries like Colombia and France have changed their laws to recognize the right to water. And in Mexico, for example, since those resolutions and since the constitutional protection of the right to water, the government has managed to extend safe drinking water to over 1,000 rural communities in Mexico. And for many of us in Canada, we take drinking water for granted, but we ought not to. It changes people's lives to have access to safe drinking water. And in Canada, a country that opposed recognition of the right to water at the UN and only changed our position after those resolutions were adopted in 2010, we have, in the last 6 years, in partnership with Indigenous communities, ended long-term drinking water advisories in over 115 Indigenous communities through investment in safe drinking water infrastructure. And the last example I'll give is, during this pandemic, a number of countries around the world prevented utility companies from cutting off people's water services for non-payment of their bills during the COVID pandemic, a move which had its roots in the right to water and which undoubtedly saved lives. So now that the right enjoys global recognition, the right to a healthy environment, the main challenge is implementation. Oh, this is just a funny picture from the Human Rights Council last Friday after the resolution was passed, celebrating. So to come back to the next challenge, which is implementation, and this is critical that we employ a human rights-based approach to tackling the climate crisis, the loss of biodiversity, pervasive pollution, and the global water crisis. That means switching away from fossil fuels to renewables as fast as possible. That means respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples to the lands, waters, and wildlife that sustain their cultures while we move towards protecting 30% of the Earth's land and waters by 2030. That means redirecting the trillions of dollars in harmful subsidies that go to fossil fuels, industrial agriculture, and overfishing towards renewable energy, energy storage, agroecology, and the conservation of biodiversity. It means focusing on the UN Sustainable Development Goals by investing in projects like the Great Green Wall of Africa, which involves planting billions of trees, restoring millions of hectares of degraded land, and bringing solar power to communities that currently lack access to electricity. This amazing project will bolster food security, create jobs, store carbon, rebuild biodiversity, and improve the lives of millions of people. This is the kind of action that can be catalyzed by the right to a healthy environment. Now, while global recognition of the right to a healthy environment recognizes that our lives, our health, our well-being, and our dignity depend on the health of this beautiful but beleaguered planet, we are not separate from or superior to nature, but rather intimately, intricately woven into the fabric of nature. We made a terrible mistake with COVID-19 in not paying attention to the warnings that scientists had been making for a number of years about the threat of zoonotic diseases. We mustn't make the same mistake again. It is not too late to respond to the global environmental crisis, but time is running out. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we must understand that nature is not a warehouse of resources for humans to exploit, but a community to which we're remarkably fortunate to belong. After all, as scientists will tell us, we share DNA, the basic building block of life, with every living thing on this planet. So I'm going to stop here. So grateful for the opportunity to be with you this evening. I'm really looking forward to your questions, which I'll hopefully be able to answer. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, David, for that lecture. What a compelling and inspiring body of work you have presented to us. I know it's the tip of the iceberg, and it's so good to get the win every now and then. And so last week's win must have been a huge motivator for you to keep going, but the examples that you have given of the successful lawsuits in various countries are also inspiring, but as you say, difficult. And we do continue to experience losses. We have got questions coming in, and I'm going to just start with this one while I look at what other people are submitting. So regarding the decision, the vote last week, what position did the Canadian delegation take on this? Well, you've told us a little bit about the process, but do you want to elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. So the United Nations Human Rights Council is a body of 47 states. And of those 47 states, Canada is not currently a member. So those 47 states are regionally distributed and they're elected to 3-year terms by the General Assembly. So it's a democratic process. Canada's, as I said, not currently a member, but over the course of the past couple of months, during the negotiations on this resolution, all states were able to put forward their positions. And the Canadian position, I regret to tell people, was opposing recognition of the right to a healthy environment on the basis of two, I would say, flimsy legal arguments. One was that the right is not recognized in any existing international human rights instrument, to which the answer has to be, well, we wouldn't be pushing forward a resolution if it was already recognized. And the second objection of the Canadian delegation was that the right to a healthy environment doesn't have a clear definition, which again is something that might sound good at first blush, but the reality is that's not how human rights work. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was introduced in 1948, not a single one of those rights was defined in that document. The definition of human rights happens over time through governments, through courts, through usage, and definitions are not fixed in time either. So the reality is that human rights evolve. If we look back 100 years, women didn't have the right to vote. If we look back in Canada, even more recently, Indigenous people didn't have the right to vote. But we have gradually moved forward. Human rights do evolve. And so Canada's objections to recognition of the right to a healthy environment really, I don't think are very strong. And I'm hopeful that the current Canadian government will actually come on board with recognition of the right to a healthy environment now that the resolution has been adopted by the Human Rights Council, in much the way we opposed recognition of the right to water. But once the UN gave it its stamp of approval, we came aboard.
Okay, thank you. So this is a follow-up question really but submitted by one of our viewers tonight. And she asked, what is keeping Canada from including the right to a healthy environment in our constitution? So it's a bit of a follow-on from what you've already saying, but what are the particular obstacles that are keeping the Canadian government from getting on board here?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say, Dr. Harvey, is that when Canada first began talking about having a charter of rights and freedoms back in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when Pierre Trudeau was the prime minister, we set up a joint committee of the Senate and the House of Commons, which went across Canada talking to Canadians about what they thought should be in the new Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it's amazing. You have to go into the kind of dusty basements of university libraries to find the transcripts of these hearings that took place across the country back more than 50 years ago. But I've done that. And what was really amazing was to see how many Canadians 50 years ago were saying our new constitution, our charter, should include the right to a healthy environment. Of course, that didn't happen. The charter was adopted in 1982 without any right to a healthy environment. And I will say there was a last-ditch effort in that process by Sven Robinson and the NDP to include the right to a healthy environment in the charter. He was actually part of a committee that was reviewing the final draft of the charter. Sven Robinson, the famous member of parliament from Vancouver, made this proposal. And the justice minister at the time was Jean Chrétien, who said, "Oh, Mr. Robinson, you want to put everything in the charter like apple pie and the recipe of my Aunt Bertha." And so the committee, which was predominantly liberals, voted down this proposal, which I think is a kind of infamous but little known moment of Canadian constitutional history. Today, the reality is that every young person, every person I meet under the age of 40 years old thinks it's an absolute no-brainer to include the right to a healthy environment in our constitution. But there is still inertia amongst older Canadians, inertia amongst Canadians who lived through the kind of constitutional crises of the 1990s. And it's very challenging to amend Canada's constitution. Legally speaking, it requires a process that is extremely difficult, involves a majority of provinces representing a majority of Canadians. And so although it's it's something that I'm sure will happen in the future. It's not on the short-term priority list for the government of Canada.
Okay, thank you. I'm scrolling through lots of questions here, and here's one I think that sort of continues on, and she asks, why do you think that so many other countries have adopted the right to clean water, yet Canada has yet to properly do so, and our government continues to ignore the many communities that do not have this luxury? There are still 51 communities that do not have access to clean drinking water. When in 2015, the government committed to end all of the long-term drinking water advisories.
Yeah, so this is a real black eye on Canada's history, I think. The fact that for so long, so many Indigenous communities went without the basic human necessity of safe drinking water. The questioner is quite right that in 2015, the government did make that commitment to end all of these long-term drinking water advisories by this year, and they have not done so, and they will not do so. But I also think that progress has been made. And, as I mentioned during my talk, 117 communities that were on that list previously now do have safe drinking water. They do have infrastructure that works. They have trained personnel to operate and maintain those facilities, which is something that wasn't happening in the past. So progress is being made. There was a class action lawsuit brought a couple of years ago on behalf of 258 Canadian First Nations, which just settled this summer for the remarkable sum of $8 billion. So $2 billion will be going to those Indigenous communities as compensation for the harm and the damages that were inflicted upon them by the failure of the government of Canada to provide safe drinking water over a period of decades. And $6 billion is budgeted for the next 8 years to provide adequate and safe drinking water through improvements to infrastructure in those 50 communities that are still without. So I do think that it's important to give credit where credit's due. Some progress is being made, but I do think the pace of change could still be accelerated.
So thank you. And this is, I'm modifying a question, one of these questions who's the questioner is asking about Canadian legislation. And so switching from sort of the constitutional protection of rights in Canada, we know that the proposed amendments to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act has a provision that says something, would say something about the right to a healthy environment. So in your view, what is that helpful to have it in a piece of legislation versus the Constitution? How much weaker is it? What's your sense of that?
Sure. So there's no doubt that constitutional recognition of the right to a healthy environment is the high bar. A constitution fulfills two really critical roles in a society. It's the highest and strongest form of law. And so all other laws, regulations, and policies must be consistent with the provisions of a constitution. And secondly, a constitution, as a South African judge once wrote, a constitution is like a mirror of a nation's soul in that it reflects our deepest and most cherished aspirations. And so I think for Canadians, with our deep-rooted pride in the resplendent nature of this country, the amazing beauty of this country, I think that culturally it would be appropriate for us to recognize the right to a healthy environment in our constitution. And the reality is that recognizing it in the legislation, as is proposed for the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, is a small but important step in the right direction. It won't have nearly the legal strength that constitutional recognition would have, but it will still compel the federal government to do a better job of improving air quality, ensuring drinking water safety, protecting biodiversity, and all of the other environmental challenges that we face.
And one more go at Canada here. This question is, in many of your examples, citizens went against the government, suing the government, demanding a healthier environment. In Canada, would it be more beneficial to protest and go against the companies who are greatly destroying the planet, or would it be more effective to go against the government?
Yeah, I don't think, I don't like either or questions. I think the answer is all of the above. And, we've witnessed over the past couple of years, the incredible power of protest, the Fridays for the Future movement that was started by the Greta Thunberg, the Swedish young person, joined now by millions of young people, interrupted somewhat by the COVID-19 pandemic, but that outpouring of energy and passion has changed government climate policies and has really provided a catalyst for more ambitious climate action. So I think that protest is a really important part of democracy, but I also think we need to do a better job of electing government representatives, members of parliament, members of legislatures who understand the gravity of these environmental crises and are willing to take bold action. We can't get to where we need to be with little incremental changes, given how serious and severe the global environmental crisis is. And in Canada, you know, I live on the west coast of Canada here. We had temperatures of almost 50 degrees this summer. We had unprecedented wildfires. We had that heat dome that we experienced in June contributed to hundreds of deaths of people in this province and the deaths of an estimated 1 billion marine animals. So that kind of gives you a sense of Canada is not immune to these global problems, whether it's pollution, biodiversity loss, or the climate crisis. We are right there. We are suffering along with people in other places. And we have a real collective responsibility to do much more to reduce our emissions as such a wealthy, high emission country.
A couple of international questions here. This one is, how is the UN going to protect the rights of climate refugees whose numbers keep increasing?
Oh boy. Well, you know, the first thing I'll say is the United Nations is an institution that represents the 193 member states. And it's really not, it really doesn't have the ability, I would say, the United Nations, it kind of sets global norms and sets, like by recognizing the right to a healthy environment, for example, but ultimately to deal with the problem of climate migrants is going to take significant action on behalf of, first of all, governments around the world to deal with the climate crisis, to reduce emissions so that we don't go beyond the 1.5 degree commitment made in the Paris Agreement. That's the first thing, is to address the problem and to minimize the number of people who are forced to migrate. The second thing that we need to do is respect the human rights of those people who are forced to migrate. The great majority of migrants are probably going to be internal migrants. That is, they move within their countries, and then there'll be a smaller flow of people that move between countries. And we have to make sure that when those people are on the move, that their rights, their basic human rights, are protected, respected, and fulfilled. There was a really fascinating case brought by a family from a small Pacific island of Kiribati several years ago. They had moved to New Zealand, and a couple from Kiribati had moved to New Zealand, raised a family there, and then their visa ran out, and they exhausted all of their legal remedies trying to stay in New Zealand. And at the end of the day, the government of New Zealand issued a deportation order, sending them back to Kiribati, at which point they brought a really novel case to the United Nations Human Rights Committee and argued that this deportation from New Zealand back to Kiribati would actually be a violation of their human rights under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And that case, it was a very novel case. They had tried to argue in New Zealand that they should be treated as climate refugees. Of course, I should clarify that under international law, there is no such thing as a climate refugee. That the International Convention on Refugees, one of the attributes that you have to meet the definition of a refugee is you have to be subject to persecution. And you know, climate change is not the kind of issue that people, there may be some circumstances where people are both being persecuted and victims of climate change, but for the most part, climate refugees aren't subject to that persecution factor. So they're not technically refugees, they're migrants. That was what the New Zealand courts determined. The UN Human Rights Committee, when it dealt with this case, said that conditions in Kiribati are not yet sufficiently severe to constitute a violation of the right to life. There were a couple of members of the committee who actually disagreed with that and wrote a dissenting opinion saying, yes, the conditions are already sufficiently severe. Lack of access to safe drinking water, problems with access to food. But the majority of the UN Human Rights Committee said that while in theory, you may have a legitimate human rights claim that would overturn that deportation order. That was not possible in the circumstances of that particular case. So I just reiterate that the key thing to do is to minimize the problem of climate migration by actually reducing emissions and restoring the sinks that absorb carbon emissions as well.
So that's an evolving field.
Very much so.
Yeah, very new. Okay, here's a question from a law student here at UMB, currently researching this topic of a clean and healthy environment and the concept of ecocide within the human rights frameworks internationally and domestically. I'm wondering if you can speak more about the idea floating around and you would know these acronyms, the ICC and the ICJ, right now about adopting a new international crime of ecocide, and if adopted, what it might look like and how it would be investigated and prosecuted.
Right. So so ICC stands for the International Criminal Court, and ICJ stands for the International Court of Justice. And it's interesting, the International Criminal Court has 4 crimes that it has jurisdiction over. And when it was actually being debated and created decades ago, there was actually a 5th crime of ecocide that was, at least for a time, on the agenda. And at the end of the day, too many states disagreed with that, and so it was dropped off. That proposal has been revitalized. There's a lot of energy behind it. Civil society organizations around the world are pushing for a new crime of ecocide to be added to the statute of the International Criminal Court. I have to say, my personal opinion is it's going to be very difficult to get states, which are the parties to that international treaty. States are very reluctant to take on obligations that could pose a threat to their sovereignty, and that's certainly what a crime of ecocide would be. So I think it'll be as attractive as the idea is. The reality is that international legal conventions and treaties require states to ratify them to come into force and effect. And I think it'll be a very uphill struggle to get any number of states to ratify an international treaty, which would then expose them to potential liability for the crime of ecocide. Because if you look at governments around the world, they are all complicit in major environmental damage, either through their own activities or through their failure to adequately regulate corporate activities.
And I think this is a similar question, although a bit different, but along the same line. Have you ever thought about the right to a healthy environment for animals, not just humans?
Ah, yes. Well, of course. And so I actually wrote a book on this called The Rights of Nature, which was published a couple of years ago, where I looked at the rights of individual animals, the rights of species, and the rights of ecosystems. And there are really fascinating legal developments around the world in each of those categories. So, for example, there are countries that have passed laws that recognize the rights of primates, that recognize the rights of cetaceans, so 2 of the most highly intelligent and also charismatic groups of species that are found in our natural world. There are many countries that have passed laws protecting endangered species, and in some of those cases, courts have interpreted those laws as basically guaranteeing the rights of those species to exist. So, for example, in India, there have been cases involving tigers and Asiatic water buffaloes in which the Supreme Court of India has said that these species have just as much of a right to exist on Earth as human beings do. And then perhaps the most well-known category is the example of rights of nature. Which is a very broad kind of concept, but 15 years ago now, Ecuador became the first country in the world to recognize in its constitution the rights of Pachamama, or Mother Earth. And since that time, Ecuador has amended over 70 different laws and policies to incorporate the rights of nature. Ecuador's neighbor Bolivia was the first country in the world to pass legislation called a law on the rights of Mother Earth. So though you have those Andean countries in Latin America that are pursuing this, there's also rights of nature legislation in Mexico. There's court decisions in Colombia. There's legislation in Uganda, court decisions in Bangladesh and India. So it's a really exciting area of law, this recognition of the rights of nature. And probably the closest parallel to Canada is actually New Zealand, where as part of reconciliation with the Maori indigenous people, the government of New Zealand has passed 2 laws which recognize the rights of nature. One of those laws involves an area that was formerly known as a national park called Te Urewera. And this law that recognizes the rights of Te Urewera gives the ecosystem the rights of a legal person. So not the same rights as a human, but the rights of a legal person, which is more tantamount to the rights of a corporation or a municipality. And then what's really remarkable is that legislation then transfers the Crown's title or the ownership of that land to the legal person representing the ecosystem. So in other words, this amazing ecosystem of mountains and lakes and forests called Te Urewera not only has the rights of a legal person, but owns itself. So if we look around the world, one of the most striking and largely unacknowledged features of the modern world is that human beings, one species out of millions of species, have staked a claim of ownership to almost every square inch of land on this planet. Well, that kind of Western paradigm of land ownership is being brought into question in New Zealand. The other law that was passed in New Zealand involves a river called the Whanganui River. And again, the Whanganui River now has the rights of a legal person. That legal person owns the riverbed under the water. So that title was transferred from the government to the river. And both of these laws set up guardians, which are comprised of a mixture of Maori persons and government representatives that are given the task of respecting and protecting the rights of those ecosystems. So it's a really exciting concept. It has just recently come to Canada in terms of recognition of the rights of the Magpie River in Quebec by both the Indigenous community that lives in that region and by the municipal government that lives adjacent to the Magpie River. So we're starting to see this concept of nature's rights entering the Canadian legal system as well. And of course, the idea that nature has rights has actually got deep roots in a lot of Indigenous legal cultures. So sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, but it's a subject of great interest to me. And I think an area of law that's really dynamic right now.
Well, I think I'm going to take another couple of questions. I have way more questions I have to say than we're going to have time for. So I apologize to everybody here. I'm just working through to see, and I'm afraid if you're kind of at the end of the list, I might not see it. But here's one actually coming from Colombia. And the question is, in respect to your mention of Colombia, what can be made to ensure the fulfillment of the right? I mean, for example, here in Colombia, the judgment you mentioned about deforestation stays just on paper. Therefore, what else can be done?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I have a couple of responses. One is that something that we haven't really talked about is, that in some countries where and it's kind of interesting. As I said, there's a lot of countries where the right to a healthy environment is in the Constitution. Some of those countries have made great progress in protecting that right by addressing air pollution, by addressing water pollution, by protecting nature. And then some countries that have the right to a healthy environment in their Constitution, there has been literally no progress whatsoever. And so what's the difference between those countries and the countries that have made progress? I think it's really comes down to something called the rule of law. And the rule of law is a concept that basically says, is there a functioning government? What are the levels of corruption? Are there effective institutions in place? Is there an independent judiciary? These are the elements of this concept of the rule of law. And if you don't have those elements, if you're in a country that's riven by civil war or that's led by a military dictatorship or where there's high levels of corruption, then the rights that are found on paper really aren't going to be respected. And that's true not only of the right to a healthy environment, but of all human rights. So one thing that really needs to be done in a lot of countries around the world is strengthening of the rule of law, strengthening government institutions, addressing the problem of corruption, making sure the judiciary is independent, etc. There's one thing that some courts in countries in the global south have done, which has been super interesting and effective to make sure that judgments like the one in Colombia are actually implemented. One is to have the government be required to come back to the court on a regular basis to report on progress in implementing the court's order. So for example, the case I mentioned from Argentina involving an extremely polluted neighborhood in the capital of Buenos Aires, that Supreme Court of Argentina decision from 2008 included an order that the federal government report to the court on a quarterly basis, so 4 times a year, about progress in implementing the court's order. And, for the Minister of Environment in Argentina to go and stand before the panel of judges and have to say, we haven't got anything done, Your Honor, was turned out to be a very uncomfortable situation, and led the government of Argentina to start making progress in implementing that judgment. And that judgment, another really interesting thing about that Argentine situation was that the order of the Supreme Court included fines that would be levied personally against government representatives if the court order wasn't implemented. So that's a couple of ways that you can actually light a fire under governments to make sure that they do comply with the order of courts. But I think the bigger issue is strengthening the rule of law. In Canada, if a government receives an order from a court, you have 100% confidence that the government will comply with that court order. That's a foundational element of the Canadian democratic system, and it has to become a foundation in countries like Colombia as well if these court judgments are going to be meaningful. I'll give you another example. I gave the example from Netherlands of the famous Urgenda decision, where the Supreme Court of the Netherlands ordered the government to reduce emissions more deeply and more quickly. The government of the Netherlands took that order very seriously and did undertake a bunch of actions. Earlier this year, the Constitutional Court of Germany, in a case, again, brought by young people, found that the German government's existing climate legislation set an insufficiently ambitious target for emissions reduction, even though it was a pledge to reduce emissions 55% by 2030, much more ambitious than the Canadian government's climate pledge. The Constitutional Court in Germany found that the rights of young people in that situation were being violated by the German government, because in the words of the court, if what the German government was basically doing was pushing the real action until after 2030 and creating a burden on young people that would really restrict their fundamental freedoms in the years after 2030. So the Constitutional Court struck down that part of the German legislation and ordered the government to do a better job. And within a matter of weeks, the German government had created a new target of reducing emissions by 65%, reducing emissions 65% by 2030, which is really, which is going to be a tall order, but the German government is really dedicated to meeting that obligation. And that reflects a strong degree of the rule of law in Germany, strong rule of law in the Netherlands, and a real need to strengthen the rule of law in other countries as well.
I'm going to try to get a few more in here before we close our Q&A session. This might take a bit, but this is a local example. So it starts recently in New Brunswick. There was a plan to poison Miramichi Lake. Now that I can fill in here. The plan is to use rotenone to eliminate an invasive species, a smallmouth bass, which is a competitor, according to many, with Atlantic salmon. So that was the poisoning strategy. The plan was shelved for this year after the Wolastoqey grandmothers and mothers refused to leave the lake. So the First Nations mothers went out on boats and just occupied the lake. What opportunities are there to prevent such action from being taken in Canada? What can we learn from the actions in other countries, and how to protect nature and stand alongside our Indigenous peoples in protecting the land?
Well, that's a really fascinating example, which I hadn't heard about. So thanks for bringing it to my attention, first of all. And I do think that, we're in a situation right now, and I was speaking about this to a different crowd earlier today, where Indigenous people in Canada, because they do have recognized rights under our Constitution, are often forced into a position where they're the ones that the rest of us are relying upon to protect nature. And it's really, given all of the historical injustices, it's a bit unfair of us to put that additional weight onto the shoulders of Indigenous people. They've done terrific things here in British Columbia. Indigenous people have protected old growth forests from logging. They have stopped commercial fisheries from happening that really shouldn't be happening because of declining fish stocks. But until we all have the right to a healthy environment, and that's really why I think it's so critically important for Canada, which is one of the last countries in the world to recognize this fundamental right. Over 80% of the world's countries recognize their citizens' right to a healthy environment. So less than 20% do not. And that less than 20% includes Canada. We really need to recognize that right so that all of us can be advocates for the environment, so that all of us can use that right to protect the nature that is really kind of the heart of who we are as Canadians. And so that's why I think it's so critically important that we continue to push forward this agenda domestically in Canada. I mean, it's great to have the United Nations recognition of the right because it's an additional impetus. And it would be great to see Canada recognize the right for the first time through the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. But ultimately, we need to make this right as strong as possible so that Canadians can use it the way that citizens in countries around the world are showing us it's a very powerful tool.
Well, perhaps this will be our final question, and it follows on what you've just said. So the questioner says, you mentioned the importance of human rights movements in enacting change around us. What might you suggest the average person could do to make an impact toward the fight for our right to a healthy environment?
Well, that's a great question to end on. And you know, the reality is that a few years ago, there was a real citizens movement in Canada that was led by the David Suzuki Foundation and Eco Justice and other environmental organizations. It was called the Blue Dot Movement. And the Blue Dot Movement actually coalesced around this idea that Canadians should have a right to a healthy environment, and their initial focus was on municipal governments. So over 150 municipal governments in all provinces across the country passed resolutions calling upon the federal government to recognize the right to a healthy environment and committing to take actions at the local level to protect the right to a healthy environment. So I think that, you know, the answer to the eternal question of what should people do is people should become as active as time and money permit, right? So if you have the time to join the Fridays for the Future movement, get out there on the streets on Fridays and join that movement. If you have the money to support the environmental organizations that are doing great work in this country, then support them. And one thing that everybody can do is exercise their democratic right to elect environmentally friendly politicians. I don't care what party they're from, but elect the best, greenest politicians you can at the local, provincial, and federal levels. And that's how we'll be able to move forward as a country.
That's always the question, what to do, right? There are a few questions like that. What can students do, you know, to bring awareness, etc. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on the student question. I think there was one of the other questions was, how would you, what would you say about, you know, sort of students, or what would you say to students who want to go into environmental studies? Questions about, you know, are you are attached to an organization and that sort of thing. So it's all around the kind of activism interest in, I'm assuming many of our participants are students.
Right. Well, I think, you know, if you're a university student, then there's all kinds of opportunities. I mean, I'm sure every university in Canada, certainly the University of British Columbia, where I teach, has all kinds of student sustainability initiatives, which are fantastic. Everything from, you know, the University of British Columbia Farm, which produces food and educates people about the importance of food and the impacts of food production on the environment, to you know, recycling initiatives, to making sure that universities divest from fossil fuel companies, which is a huge student-led movement around the world that's been very powerful and very effective. And then taking, you know, I think that one of the beautiful things about being a university student is you can have these experiences at your university, gain the tools and gain the experiences that then you can take to the next level and pressure municipal governments, pressure provincial governments, pressure the federal government. That one of the interesting things about Canada is it's really a small country in a political sense. You can even if you're a student, you can call up your member of parliament and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about this, or call up your member of the legislative assembly. You can make submissions to City Hall. You can have influence on policy making. And so you can do that as an individual. Of course, there's strength in numbers. So to the extent you can join organizations, that's really a terrific way to get involved. I mean, I broke into the environmental movement over 30 years ago by volunteering with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, with the Western Canada Wilderness Committee, and then with a little ragtag outfit called the Sierra Legal Defense Fund, which has grown over time into Eco Justice, Canada's leading nonprofit environmental law firm. And so those volunteer experiences, I met people that I'm still friends with today. I had experiences that have been the foundation of what I'm doing today. And so I think there's just incredible opportunities for people to get involved, to get active. And I can tell you, it's extraordinarily rewarding. Not that rewarding in the financial sense, but much more rewarding in the non-pecuniary sense. And I can guarantee you'll meet a bunch of fantastic people. I mean, the one really crazy thing about being the UN Special Rapporteur, I've met in the last 3 years, I've met literally thousands of amazing people from virtually every country in the world that are trying to make this world a more just and sustainable place. It's incredibly inspiring and sustaining. And so, I really encourage students to follow your heart. If you're passionate about this, then you will find a career in this field. There are so many challenges in terms of air, water, climate, biodiversity. There will never be an end to employment opportunities in this field in our lifetime. So I think that young people have a lot to bring to the table. I think we need some changes in Canada so that young people's voice is heard much more loudly and clearly by our political leaders. I've come across countries around the world that have lowered the voting age to 16, for example. I was a part of a webinar in Scotland a few weeks ago with the Scottish National Children's Parliament, where children are elected and have an influence on government policy. And I just think fantastic. They have all of these amazing ideas, this energy. Let's bring them into the decision-making fold. And we don't do that very well in Canada, and we should.
That's a perfect way to end this section of the evening. Thank you very much, David, for spending this time with us. Again, my apologies to those of you who submitted all of these wonderful questions. We simply couldn't get to them all. And at this point, I'm not sure whether I'm turning the mic now over to Zena, or whether Shannon Brooke, you're jumping in at this point to set us up. Or maybe
I'll take it over from here. Thank you. My great pleasure I want to thank the guest presenter on behalf of the Vigod family. I wanted to say that over the years, the Vigod Memorial Lecture, we've attempted to choose topics that are of current relevance to enhance our understanding of human rights issues and engage us in dialogue. And this topic today on human rights and the environment is so critical to the health and well-being of our society. Dr. Boyd, it is a privilege to have you share your expertise with us. You have truly enlightened us on what it means, the transformative potential of the right to a healthy environment. Time has come, as you say, to ensure worldwide that a healthy environment is a fundamental human right. And as we heard the announcement last week of the UN Human Rights Council is so critical and due in no small way to all of your efforts, Dr. Boyd. You have helped clarify what a right to a healthy and sustainable environment means, and have highlighted why it is so essential for governments to enshrine this right into the constitutions and into legislation. And you have made me think more about the issue of inequality and the environment, that all individuals, no matter where they live, the color of their skin, whether rich or poor, have the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And I was really encouraged to hear all the examples that you highlighted where progress has been made, but I do believe that there is still much more that needs to be done. And what you have said, first of all, the importance of recognizing and accepting the right to a healthy environment, and then clarifying what it means. And also what's critical, as you pointed out, that we need to strengthen the rule of law and ensure accountability by governments. And hopefully these actions will help accelerate the implementation of actions that will fulfill this right, so that we can move forward to a more just, healthy, and sustainable future. So thank you so much for your profound insights and sharing your expertise with us. The Atlantic Human Rights Center, as you can see on the screen, would like to honor you with an award for excellence in the service of human rights. Thank you for your outstanding contribution to the area of human rights. And we will courier this award to you, so it's not just on the screen. Great, thank you. I also have the honor, I think you can remove the screen there. I also have the honor to announce this year's recipient of the Dr. Vigod Memorial Scholarship. This award is given by the University of New Brunswick's History Department to an outstanding student in the honors program in history. When we were considering establishing a scholarship, there were very few undergraduate scholarships. So Bernie always encouraged students to take history honors programs, so the family felt and the history department felt that this would be an appropriate scholarship in his memory. So I would like to thank the University of New Brunswick and the history department for your continued support of this scholarship. Thank you goes to Dr. Lisa Todd, who's chair of the UNB History Department, Dr. Cindy Brown, who's director of the UNB History Honors Program, Misty Sullivan, UNB History Administrator, and Carolyn Williston-Aubie in the Faculty of Arts. And this year's recipients are, as you can see on the screen, Caitlin Hyslop Margison. Caitlin is actually a repeat recipient, now in her 4th year of an undergraduate honors program degree in history and sociology. Congratulations, Caitlin. I know that you were on the Zoom event. I'm pleased to hear that you are concurrently doing an accelerated Master's of Arts in Sociology. And also, I have been told that you are currently the principal investigator on a grant from the Department of National Defense researching far-right conspiracy theories in Canada and the Canadian Armed Forces. And you are still planning on pursuing doctoral studies in this area. Congratulations. And the second recipient is Emma Govan, who is a 3rd-year student pursuing an undergraduate joint honors program in history and English. I hear you are interested in studying underrepresented and overlooked areas of history and plan to study history at the graduate level. My daughters, Simone and Michelle Vigod, and I and the Vigod family wish you both lots of luck in all your future endeavors. I would like to take this opportunity also to thank a number of other people that have made this lecture possible. I think you can remove that from the screen. Thank you. Our moderator, Dr. Janice Harvey. We are very honored, Janice, to have you facilitate this lecture, and you've done such an wonderful job. And you also have such an extensive background in environmental issues. So we were so pleased to have you. You've had a long, outstanding advocacy work also with environmental organizations. So thank you so much, Janice, for all your efforts this evening. And a heartfelt thank you to St. Thomas University, President Don Russell, for your opening remarks and your kind words in memory of Dr. Vigod. And of course, for St. Thomas University's continued support for the Vigod Memorial Lecture for so many years, and 31 years to be exact. And a special thank you goes to Dr. Shannon Brooke Murphy, Acting Director of the Atlantic Center for Human Rights, who organized the Vigod lecture this year, while Christina Shirley, the director, is on sabbatical. Dr. Murphy is also the endowed chair in human rights at St. Thomas University and is an assistant professor in the human rights department. I personally appreciate, Shannon, all your work and efforts to organize this event. And thank you also goes to Christina for securing our guest speaker. I would also like to thank Brianna Bourgeois, the center's administrative assistant, Jeffrey Carlton, STU's Associate Vice President of Communications, Jacqueline Cormier from STU Communications, and a heartfelt thanks to Michael McCracken for all your support with the technical aspects of this program. And in closing, I would like to say, history was Dr. Vigod's life career, but advocating for human rights was his passion. And I often use the quote that Dr. Vigod lived by and is so applicable to our discussion today from Rabbi Hillel. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am for myself alone, who am I? And if not now, when? I strongly feel that increasing our understanding and enhancing actions on the right to a healthy environment needs to happen now. Thank you all for joining the Zoom event. We hope that you have found this event informative and that it has helped inspire you to advocate for actions that will enhance the right to a healthy and sustainable environment. Thank you all.